Hi, everybody, and welcome to this panel where we're going to be talking about designing for the enterprise. My name is Hans van Dam. I'm one of the founders at Conversation Design Institute, and I'm here today with a very talented group of people that all have opinions and experience in designing for the enterprise. So let's introduce ourselves. Let's start off with Emily.
Hi there, my name is Emily. I'm the head of growth at VoiceFlow. We're a low-code, no-code solution to design, prototype, or launch any voice or chat experiences. And super excited to be here today to kind of talk about where that consumer side's going and also how it's been bleeding and interfacing with enterprise.
Thank you. Next on our list, Joseph.
Hi, I'm Joseph. I'm a copywriter, conversation designer, and an IT delivery process engineer. I focus on building bot factories at enterprise level and keep them in best practices.
So much. Mr. Phillips.
Hey everyone, my name is Casey. I'm a senior product manager for digital assistants and messaging experiences at Intuit. I'm just really excited to share my feedback and experiences helping to scale chatbots at the enterprise level.
Yeah, and I think that's already what we can tell here is from everybody has this enterprise perspective that we're going to be talking about today. And I think one of the key challenges, if you do some research on Google, you find a lot of articles from people like teaching how to develop something from the Google Assistant or a very simple chatbot. But what's the difference really between designing one simple experience, a standalone thing, versus an operation that might have a million conversations a day? I don't know if Emily, from your experience at VoiceFlow, you probably see the product be used differently at a certain point. So what are some of the things that you see that are key to making this work at enterprise level?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people when they think about voice, and this is kudos to Google and Amazon for really popularizing that at scale, kind of think about it as these smart speakers that are in there. And the way that people interact with it, the sensationalism of it, the kind of one-liners and those quick functional triggers that we're so used to, like weather or quick one answers or recipes. However, when you look at that beyond kind of the consumer level, beyond that sensationalist piece, there's a lot of function and scalability and dynamic context and content that ultimately is served up on the enterprise side. And what we've really seen from how these two pieces really marry together is on the enterprise level, it allows them to really functionally kind of sort and match a lot of content to the correct time, to the correct people in ways that are more accessible. And on the consumer side, you're seeing a much larger willingness for them to communicate via different channels, for them to use perhaps these smart speakers or the familiarity of chatbots as a catalyst to understand and want to interact with that channel as an option right out of the gate. And so I think from the enterprise side, we're seeing a lot of learnings from what they've seen works well with engaging and getting people interested in conversation design from the consumer side, but are leveling it up with these amazing teams, linguists, content managers, content systems to really create something that's functional and, more importantly, scalable. Because you don't want to just have this one sensational, one functional piece that could do very, very well on consumer be the solution entirely for an enterprise. And that's where this goes from kind of being more of like an art to something that's really quite scientific.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'd agree with that. I mean, my experience at Bell is the same, where suddenly the amping up how they can serve customers better, faster, quicker, focus effort, where the VA can take over regular grunt work and allow human agents to spend more time with customers and genuinely improve the customer experience all around. And that's what's driving us and driving the uptick and use of the technology.
What do you see at Intuit, Casey? Because what I'm hearing from the others, it becomes about customers want this, and it's easy to use, so it's great. But now the challenge at the enterprise, it becomes about content management, it becomes about organizational stuff. So rather than just writing a nice dialogue. So how's the balance for you at Intuit in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's definitely a tough balance. And I think you have to kind of take it on a case-by-case basis, especially at the enterprise level. Because I think one of the things that I've really seen that separates writing content answers at the enterprise level versus the smaller scales. It's very rare, like if we were to create like an intent for one of the chatbots into it, that intent would have a single answer, because that answer a lot of times is going to vary so much on the users, because you're talking about hundreds of millions of users, and all those users, like especially if we're talking about taxes or finances, you think about all the variables that could impact the correct answer for the user. I mean, you're talking about the user's tax filing status, the state that they're in, like they could even vary on like what TurboTax product they're in, or what SKU if it's more of a product support question. So I think the kind of the points of data that you have to actually kind of be able to manage to actually truly serve up the correct answer for as many users as possible gets really challenging. So I think a lot of it is just kind of looking at it, figuring out like, okay, like, to what level do we really want to customize and use that data to try and answer every user's question right? Or is like this more like an intent or something that it may be better to just maybe build two like variations and that will cover 80% of the users, to the other 20%. You could end up just building so much rules and logic that you end up breaking things you can't manage. Just there's always that balance of how deep do you go to really satisfy all the users, but also preserving the fact that you don't want to build like this beast that you can't handle, and then you're not able to be agile and you're not able to kind of grow and improve further. So I think it's just kind of always a balance of, how do you do the best for the users and try your best to actually answer the question exactly the way they need it, while kind of preserving the architectural integrity of your product and making sure it's scalable going forward.
Yeah, so what kind of content is suitable for, but if you're an organization, there's so much content that's probably already suitable for a conversational interface, that then you're dealing with all the technical complexity with competing intents in your intent architecture. So part of it is that rigorous product ownership in a way of long tail design. This is what we hand over. This is where we simply say, no, we cannot help you, or this is where we make it generic. Because too much is possible, do you need to be very rigid in your decision making? Is that what I'm, yeah?
You stick to your MVP. You have to stick to your MVP, because at this scale, when there are so many people involved, if you haven't pinned down exactly where you're going and how you're going to get there, then you start getting into cost overruns and timelines that get broken. Then everybody's in a state of catch up, and it can cause problems, especially at enterprise level. When something goes wrong and you have 14,000 people suddenly having a negative brand experience before you even know about it, it's about getting all that stuff right up front.
That's interesting. And I'm kind of like, I'm personally like developing like an integral perspective on conversational AI, where it's like, okay, it's mindset, it's on the individual level, it's mindset and behavior, so your ability, but then as a collective, it's culture and system. So it's governance, it's corporate culture, it's the technology that you have. How does that, Joseph, at that enterprise level, what do you see around, stakeholder support, stakeholder management? What are some of the challenges there? How do you create that culture, almost like a conversational mindset throughout the entire organization, to create a room to leverage conversational AI?
I think the most important thing that we're doing is the shift in, let's stop calling it a virtual assistant and let's call it a digital person, a digital colleague. And how are we going to train and upskill that person to work alongside us? And that starts people thinking a little bit differently about, oh, well, it's just a bot. It starts opening them up to the potential that the virtual assistant can actually deliver. Then there is governance is really important, because it sets a tone of expectation of whatever that bot persona should be. So for example, we talk about things like transparency. What is your policy? Is it always going to be people know that they're talking to a bot? or could John or Sue that you just interact with, you don't even know if they're real or not. That's important. Let people know. It's privacy and security, chit chat. What do you do? Health boundaries. For example, we're concerned about inclusion and diversity. So on our governance level and council, we would have a diversity officer that makes sure from the get-go. And all of that goes out into the culture specifically of the team, because the team could be quite big, in our case, perhaps over 50 people, but they're all thinking along a certain way that this is who the persona is. It matches the culture of the brand, and we go from there.
Yeah,
But bake it in at the beginning.
At the beginning. And do you see, because I guess, Emily, you have a lot of enterprises reaching out, kicking off their project. Do you see them now doing these types of things at the beginning? Or are you advocating for that? What do you see from your perspective as a vendor, I guess?
I think we're in a really interesting position right now where we have there are some historic or more stable enterprise use cases for chat and voice that have kind of historically been there, like the IVR, or let's say more formally a support bot or a routing bot. However, there's also these newer interfaces, these newer experiences that people are building for inherently for this new expectation of offline engagement. So you're looking at drive-throughs, or you're looking at people's engagement. And even when you let's say go into a mall and you're used to using a touch screen to go find places, is that going to be the correct way of doing that moving forward? Or we sometimes like to muse on elevators even as an interface, as a group of people that are coming out of a global pandemic. Do we want to do that? I don't know. And so there are the historic questions and historic ways of kind of now those enterprise teams rethinking, or maybe looking at what their assistant persona, sonic branding, earcons, let's say set intents or repetitive intents look like, and maybe challenging it from a diversity perspective, or maybe challenging it from what or how does it align with our company goals. And then on the flip side, you have companies that have never historically played in this space who are now jumping into it and thinking about it in different ways, or trying to make parallels to perhaps some of the thought that went into what is their culture internally and how does that reflect externally in this advocate character or in this digital person, digital assistant. And you have on the far right side of that, looking at Samsung, who just released a digital face to their product. What is she going to sound like? What is she going to look like? What does she care about? And then you have the non-visual side of it, of if you, for instance, even think about how you interact with brands online, like Wendy's versus your bank, you have different personas in your head automatically of kind of how are they going to sound, how are they going to react, and does this persona reflect that? So I think we're seeing more and more teams thinking about that earlier on, or really spending more time really baking that into their scripting process and who they hire or what they're looking for.
And also because it's sorry.
Yeah, I see that too now. I think where 3 years ago, when CDI started, we had to explain to these enterprises, okay, you're building with technology, but actually the reason you're not getting value is that you need conversation designers. And now I think conversation design is part of the shopping list already when these enterprises are starting a project. But then, so there's the people at the core of the team are aware of it now that need to make it successful. But then there's even also that extra layer of stakeholders around it that you also sort of need to take under your wings and explain to them why it is so important. I think making them part of Wizard of Oz testing is great because they get to experience it immediately. But how is that into that, Casey? What's the conversational culture around these projects and design teams?
Yeah, I think the culture is very collaborative. I mean, there's many organizations that are involved. I mean, you have everything from people that really focus on voice and tone. You have people that specialize in actually kind of designing the flows of the conversation. You have individuals like myself, more so on the product management aspect of looking for where are the opportunities where we can actually implement the digital assistant, to kind of looking at a little bit from a higher level. Then you also have your engineering piece, those actually kind of do the back end coding. And then you even have like people involved from like a data science perspective as well. So there's a lot of cross-org collaboration that really has to happen. So you have to have a lot of a lot of buy-in at the overall leadership level, and just a lot of commitment. I think it's something that takes a lot of time, and there's really like a lot of moving pieces, a lot of moving teams. I think it's just really important that if you're really trying to develop a culture that's going to yield positive results at the enterprise level, I think there has to be you really have to start off with like really targeted goals of what you're looking for from chatbots to the enterprise level. And then I think also as well, like having patience and understanding that you're not going to just spin up a team and 3 months later you're going to have this chatbot that's going to kind of revolutionize your product. I mean, it's going to take time. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in chatbot suits at the enterprise level, I think a lot of it is the more time you have the chatbot in production, the more like time you have users interacting with it. You get all this data, and then you can feed that data to all the teams that are working on it. It really allows you to make things better. So I think, to me, I think one of the key things are really just fostering a good culture for and having the organization set up, and just having, the right expectations from the front, and having leadership support, and making sure they have a reasonable timeline, understanding that the chatbot's always going to be an iteration. Like I never looked at a single chatbot worked on. It's like, this is complete and this is done. Like it may be the best that we can have that day, but like something's going to happen like in a month or a year, or even a week or the next day, that's going to change the way users interact with it. It's going to change what users ask. So it's constantly always changing. So I look at chatbots just like, it's a current state, like it's never finished, it's never going to be completed. And it's just a constantly iterating and constantly kind of growing product.
Especially at enterprise level, because there are so many users all the time. You have so much data coming in literally every day that there is going to be something happening all the time. There's always another iteration.
Yeah. And so what we're sort of, I think, so far talked about is that at enterprise level, there's so much you can do, and there's so much content that can be leveraged, and you need to be very careful and rigid in road mapping. And then, around that, you need to have sort of that stakeholder support that understands what conversational AI, that not just what is a chatbot, what's conversational AI, what's the workflow, what's the culture that we need for that. And then those people, I guess, need to have the faith, or really need to believe that simple is already difficult enough. And I think one of the conversations that we always stumble upon is like, do you go broad or do you go narrow and deep, or what's the balance between those elements once you start this project? So Casey, what are some of the things there that you're thinking about at Intuit, that sort of balance, and who's also involved with that decision making around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in terms of going broad and narrow, again, I think it's a lot like on a case by case basis, and it could depend on, it could depend maybe on the company or the industry that you're in, but I think it's like case by case basis where I try and like really kind of guide my thought process of determining like when we go broad and narrow. It's just really kind of looking like where the value is, and like making sure that we're trying to do our best for like the actual largest subset of users. So trying to do our best for like the user base as a whole, because I think it can be very easy. And I'm sure like Joseph and Emily have seen the same thing, where you can easily start looking at the data that's coming, looking at the transcripts, and you can find like a very small percent of users that like you're not handling well, and you could go down rabbit holes and try and like completely solve for them. But the problem is sometimes if you try and solve for like a very minute use case, or like a minority of users, you can actually hurt the majority of users. So it's really kind of finding that balance and determining like where are those opportunities where like you may want to go really deep and the value's there, but also understand those opportunities that you can't go deep on everything. So when you are going to go deep, it has to be like you have to be solving a really big problem, and the value really has to be there for both the users and the business. And if the value is not really there, then it's probably just there, like, solving for the whole. So I always try and think of the user collective as a whole, and like doing the best for all of the users, and not trying to get, too hurt on a personal level when you've designed something and you think it's going to work great, and for 1% of the users, like they're stumbling on that experience. I think you have to look at like the collective as a whole and how you're performing.
Yeah.
like that. And how does so let's say I have a bunch of FAQs, and it's just pretty broad, and then I have like a few very deep mission critical journeys. What does that do with expectation management? So if maybe one problem I solve to perfection that's so critical, but then the other stuff I'm just handing them off. I don't know if anyone has any data on or experience with how customers see that. I like to say people and customers rather than users. I was told once only drug dealers have users. And I was like, you should see them as people. I just like that makes a lot of sense. Because if we want more empathy and more human centricity in these conversations, let's talk about people.
I think there's an element that we haven't really spoken about that might help with that decision of broad or narrow, and where does it fall on our 80-20 rule factor, right? And it's one of the processes that we at Bell are kind of focused on too, is get the metrics decided up front. When you're starting to design, get everybody on the same page. This is what we're measuring. This is what the KPIs we're looking for. And there's a subset of data that when you start looking at those edge cases and figuring out where does this fit in, do we dev this now or do we push it out later? Or if you're kind of aligned onto what you're measuring, then you know, yes, it's being measured or not. And if those goals are achieved, it makes it easier to decide whether you dev something right away or whether you can push it out for a later iteration.
I think
one of the
things that we see, and it's funny hearing both Joseph and Casey talk about it, where it's like when we view enterprise, it's almost like we're talking to you guys. So it's like an interesting like dynamic to kind of hear the other side of it. And I think that there's a lot of parallels, even that falls on the creator side for us as well, where like, do we create a delightful experience for like every designer that comes in because they spend most of their time in the product? Or do we spend our time catering to feedback that comes in from the loudest person in the room? Because I think like the issue with what ends up happening, and I've heard this time and time again, even when we're talking to conversation design teams, is that like even if you use like Yelp as an example, like the people who leave reviews on that are people that have like hardcore, super happy, great experiences, or the people who are really, really mad, but they're not the overall user that is actually going through those experiences. So that data becomes incredibly muddy and difficult and hard to ignore when like you have other people who are getting, especially on teams, like out of context feedback, not seeing the larger picture that we spend more of our time kind of doing. And I think there's definitely a movement towards having very many different accessible and like large ways of us collecting that data that is a little bit more scalable than constantly doing Wizard of Oz testing or user group testing or kind of jumping into cohorts. Because the reality of that is that we're always, as teams, going to have competing priorities and need to have pressure to kind of move forward. So I think to answer even like your question, Hans, about like that process of like, do you do something really, really well and then everything else is kind of handoff, is I think like you approach that, or at least what I've kind of seen from talking to teams, is that it's never going to be something you have to apologize for when you create like one really freaking good, delightful experience that people love to talk about, because you're building up at what we like to call like customer moats on them, their willingness to be okay with you messing up a little bit on something else. And ultimately people just want to, in a lot of cases for enterprise, get help or get an answer that is more suited to them. And the reality of AI and our conversation designs right now is that we're not going to be perfect out of the gate, much like a person isn't perfect out of the gate after you hire them. So like work on one deep T first, do handoffs for the other, and prioritize where are those other handoffs going. If there's a huge subset here, start to work on that one as your next sprint, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So what I like, it's okay to make mistakes. And I think that's also where personality content is, there's persona, tone of voice, but then there's also personality content. And personality content makes people more forgiving for when the bot then makes a mistake. And that's how you build that relationship over time as well. One thing that I do notice, a lot of times designers tend to apologize for things they don't have to apologize for, or the bot apologize, right? So somebody will reach out to you on your website and ask a question to the bot, and the designer that's part of the team thinks, oh, if only I had that integration, I could have solved this problem, right? If only if only that engineer wasn't that busy, I would have had this integration and we could have done this transactionally and it could have been, a very successful journey. But now I can't do that. So I'm going to hand you off to this website where you can do it yourself in 2 minutes. I am sorry, I can't help you with that, but here you can do it yourself. Whereas actually, like you asked this question, that's a great question. If you go here, you'll have it sorted out in 2 minutes. Yeah. It's a positive answer, but somehow because our design teams think, they sort of think of what it could have been. So they have a negative perspective on what it is, while it's actually still providing value for customers. I always find that very interesting. You see that a lot. We have a couple minutes left, and I think, Joseph, what was interesting, you mentioned earlier, like having the what do you call it, diversity officer or inclusion, particularly at enterprise, when we're dealing with so many customers and everybody has their own, part of our manifesto, we want to be inclusive in how we speak, but also in how we respect and understand people's linguistic preferences. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how you're dealing with that, where people, might say things, use different words based on their identities and how they were brought up, and how do you train for that?
I think one of the advantages that we have in Canada, for example, is that we are an immigrant country, and we have, just within the immediate population, we have an incredible depth of diversity. In Toronto alone, over 300 spoken languages. So even when you look at your team, you're very rare to almost have two of the same kind, just about. So we're lucky in that we get it right from the source. But something like inclusiveness, diversity, and perhaps even not part of this discussion, but in how bots are perceived by people in general, we really do have to be careful about it. So it's important the language is checked. We listen for any sensitivities. We make it a focus. We make it a focus. And when it's made a focus, it stays top of mind with people. They become aware of it and work with it accordingly. It's not difficult to do. It's just have it top of mind so that when you do design something, it will just flow. A little caveat to what you said earlier, being Canada again, and a propensity for bots to say sorry when your designer is Canadian. I see someone else giggling in the room there. There could be a lot of sorries, and for everything. So certainly there has been some time that I have spent going through some of the flows and taking sorries out and turning it into a more positive driven engagement, like you mentioned as an example earlier.
That's brilliant. I'm thinking now with for Casey, because I guess a lot of people find it very difficult with tax rates. A lot of the products are going to be very tricky, I guess, for people that they're dealing with. And I was like, you have inclusion in terms of linguistic preferences, but also in language ability in a way, right? And stuff might be complex, or they might not, know the words. What can you say about that at Intuit? Because I can imagine, financial products being complicated. A lot of people needing to file their taxes, having no idea how to do that in general.
Yeah, it's definitely very hard. I mean, there's definitely, I think there's a lot of like user personas at play that even make it more complicated. Like you have, some people that will use the financial products, and they may be like a power user and they're very adept, and they would almost, like the way that they would interact with the chatbot is, almost very much like someone internally at Intuit, like myself, has a really good understanding would. But then on the flip side, you have the persona of users who they're not very well versed in the financial spectrum, and they're going to end up asking things to the chatbot that are going to come across in a way that you would just never expected as someone built it. So I think it's very important to make sure that we're constantly mining and monitoring the data to really figure out how our users truly asking it, but also making sure that we can cover all the personas of users. We're still going to have some users who can refer to things in very complex, tax or financial jargon, but then there's going to be some users who are going to like say things like much more basic. Like for example, a certain user may say, hey, like where to add another W2. Like some users don't know, like some users will ask like to do something and they'll know the specific tax form. And other users will be like, hey, I need to enter, my winning some horse races. Where another user could say, I need to go to, I don't know, whatever it is, form 1240, I don't know, whatever tax form you would enter income from like, gambling winnings, and they know it. So you really have to account for all of that use cases. I think one of the things that we always try to think about as well, just kind of to wrap up the conversation with like broad and narrow, just to be really looking at when we're going to provide the answers to these questions, what's the implication of a wrong answer? And thinking of this is something where a user is asking like advice. If the user wants to say, like, what's the best, tax filing method or something great. Like if we answer that wrong, the implications of that are huge. We could have the user chooses a tax filing status isn't best for them. So I think a lot of us really kind of think about what's the implication. I think that's another part that kind of drives like, that's probably a topic where like, probably not worth trying to figure that out and solve the chatbot. Like that's more of like the chatbot can do like a seamless handoff to human. So I think that's another thing that we kind of try and factor into this, and we're thinking about the complexities of taxes. Like, is it too complex, and is the risk of a wrong answer just like going to be really painful for the user and also really painful for the brand? And being able to know those situations and just streamline getting them to a live human.
And at enterprise level, you could give that wrong advice thousands of times a day.
Oh yeah, maybe even.
Right? I mean, that's what keeps me up at night. That kind of, right?
Yeah.
I think a hot take on inclusivity on that, I think, is that, and maybe this is just me getting like PTSD from being a Canadian that moved to the States and having a complicated tax situation. But I think that there's also a lot of power in also excluding, or not necessarily excluding, a person or a persona, but knowing when like your bot is not going to be the right solution for them. And I think in particular, when you look at enterprise, there's some sensitive things that come up in these experiences at scale that are not ever going to be the correct way of handling totally automated. Like for instance, I'm a dual citizen. When I asked anything on like Intuit, or let's say on even like my Canadian software that I used to use, like it would ask me assuming that I was almost entirely like that I was a resident of that, not knowing there was this whole other bracket that makes my life very, very complicated. So this is my PTSD speaking, but in those scenarios, like I was thankful when I hit a wall that was like, hey, like you don't qualify for this thing. We recommend that you check this out because you might qualify for X. Like, I think that's a really good scenario of being artful and helpful without getting that risk of potentially serving up the wrong answer. And that's incredibly important from the enterprise side, and still saves time on the customer side coming in and having those conversations.
Yeah, which almost has to do, I guess, with like corporate empathy for understanding the trouble that you can get people into as well. And we're gonna wrap up here because we want to have a few more minutes for Q&A also that we're going to be doing live. But I think what we've learned so far is that when you get to enterprise level, there's a whole lot of other stuff that's going to come into play, because there's so much you can do. There's so much content available. There's so many stakeholders and enterprise dynamics that you need to manage and navigate. So having all of that be factored in, you need to be very careful about what you choose to do, because you want to be very specific on a few mission critical journeys, have some other easy things around that, but then you got to train your model, make sure it's inclusive, that it respects everybody. You're going to learn from the data. If there's so much already to be done in one simple journey, it's really don't do too much too fast, I think is really the key. Have a good workflow, have a good team, make sure stakeholders support what you're doing, and keep it simple and learn, because it's going to be very tricky.
But also to remember that at enterprise level, you also have a ton of resources that you can use and that you can put into play. A lot of our bot issues are solved by actually looking at other departments' internal ops and going, okay, there you go. We don't have to solve this. It's been done already. How do we adapt it into the design for the bot?
Yeah.
So there
learn
are lots
from
of
other
answers
departments,
within the
yeah.
system, as well as the challenges.
I like that. And on that final note, thank you everybody so much for being part of this panel. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. And I hope everybody else there will be around for questions now live. So thank you.